Hello, welcome to episode 41 of The Board. I'm Gavin Coughlin, Agile coach here at Boost. We're broadcasting live from the Boost headquarters. Today we're going to be talking about velocity, what it means to us, and if anybody is watching, you can let us know what it means to you as well.
Cool. Hi, and I'm Jess, another Agile coach here at Boost.
And we're both wearing the Agile coach uniform of blue check shirts today. So we're going to talk about velocity and what it means to us, and this is something that comes up a lot for us. People ask us about velocity, and we've seen velocity used well, I'd say, and we've also seen velocity misused as well. So it's something that I thought was worth discussing, really.
Yeah.
And for me, it's come up because recently I saw a company who have a velocity. But the management project how many story points they need completed each quarter, and they expect that amount of story points to be completed, and if that's not met, there's lots of difficult questions asked, and for me that's not the best use of a team's velocity. For me, a team's velocity is useful for the team itself, but taken out of that context, it loses its value, and it's just putting the team under undue pressure. And if you ask the team, if you said to the team, we need 20 points this sprint, and they've only been doing 12 points, that's their average velocity, well then they're going to, whether it's conscious or unconscious, they're going to game the system a little bit and start estimating.
Yeah. Overestimating stories.
Yeah, exactly.
To get that velocity up.
Mm-hmm.
I think, should we take a step back quickly and just explain what velocity is, I suppose, just for anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about.
Probably an excellent idea, actually, making a few assumptions there.
So velocity, the way we calculate that is taking an average of the points that a team delivers in sprints. So if your team over 5 sprints had managed to deliver 50 points, their velocity would be 10 points a sprint. Whether they had managed, the actual sprint numbers may not reflect that. They may have delivered 5 points in one sprint and 20 points in the next, but we look at the velocity, the average over time. And I think your point there about management imposing a sort of a goal for the team of an unreasonable amount of points is something we see quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Your team might be tracking along at sort of 15 points a sprint, and then all of a sudden they're like, okay, well, you guys just work harder and we'll get 20 points done.
Yeah.
And that often results in sort of all kinds of issues, and you never reach your goal of 20 points.
Yeah.
And often you fall well short.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's interesting, that people sort of misuse it rather than
and I've also seen situations where if a team has a velocity of, say, 15 points, and in our situation we'll have a client, and the client will say, well, the team's getting through 15 points per sprint, and we're spending roughly this much per sprint, so therefore each point equals that amount of money, and then they'll project how many points the team might get through in the next 6 months based on their velocity, and they'll use that to come up with a budget, which is fine in some ways, but also if they're going to hold to that and stick firm to that, that's problematic, because a point shouldn't be equated to time or money explicitly, I don't feel.
No, and I think again it comes into this back to sort of those principles of it's the team managing their workload, mm-hmm. and points are really for the team to decide how much effort is involved in developing a certain feature, mm-hmm.
And
it's not about giving the product owner some sense of this feature is going to cost me $1,000 or $10,000.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they can use that to points to estimate that kind of thing. But it's not a tool, I don't think, to be used to hold the team to account.
Well, what do you think velocity is useful for?
Well, So I read an interesting blog from Mike Cohen recently talking about story points from the team's point of view, and saying that a point is not about how many hours something will take. So using the example of two people going for a run.
Yep.
So if you and I met at a trail and you say, all right, this trail is going to take me half an hour to run. And I say, okay, well, this trail is going to take me an hour to run. We can sit and argue who's right forever, but actually we're both right. You're a better runner than I am. It's going to take you half an hour. I'm not a great runner. It's going to take me an hour. What we should be doing, and where story points come in, is talking about distance. So we can both say, all right, this trail is 1.5 Ks long, and both of us know how much effort is required to complete the trail. Maybe you're going to take half an hour. You're a more experienced developer. I'm not an experienced developer, so it's going to take me longer. But the story points give us a way of having a useful conversation about work and how much effort is required.
Yeah. And you know, when you're estimating stories, as with many things in Agile, the best thing to come out of it is the conversation that's had around it. And I know we've mentioned this before, but just to go over quickly again, like if somebody estimates something as, say, this is a size 8 in terms of complexity and effort, and somebody says it's a size 3, then there's obviously a bit of a disparity there. We're just getting some comments here on the slightly awkwardly placed laptop. Nathan Donaldson, who is the owner of Boost, actually my money is on Jesse. I think that's in terms of our running skills. Well, I don't know what might make you think that. But anyway, so
we'll have to see.
Yes, we'll have a go after this. But as long as it's not larger or longer run than 20 yards, because I get quite tired quite fast.
Excellent. You've been boot camping, so you should be.
I've been boot camping. Anyway, that's going off point slightly. So yes, if two team members size something and there's a large disparity in the size, then the conversation that comes out of that is really, for me, the valuable part, because you find out if somebody has completely different ideas about something, if they know something that their team member doesn't know, and vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then, you have that conversation. Hopefully you'll get to some consensus at that point.
Yeah.
And that's when sizing is really fantastic thing. And we had a team recently, I had a team recently, it's just a 2-person team, because this is a smallish project. We have a designer and we have developers for a mobile app. And they were sizing stories, and at some point throughout the project, the developer said to me, I'm not feeling we're getting much value out of estimating stories here, because Mike's estimating from a designer's point of view, and I'm estimating from a developer's point of view. And really we just concede to the other person, whether it's a design heavy story or a development heavy story. And that made a lot of sense to me, and had a discussion about what impacts they thought it would have if they dropped estimating out of it. Would there be any negative impacts? And they both seemed to agree with it. So we didn't estimate the next sprint to see how that would affect things. And they've been working in Scrum teams for a long time, so they have a good sense of when a story is too big and when it needs to be broken down without actually estimating it. And that's fine. So that's one project where we've just done away with estimating. We still talk about the stories at sprint planning. We still talk about what needs to be done, but we have done away with the planning poker that we actually used to use.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So does the team just, during sprint planning, when they're laying out the stories, do they just stop at gut feel?
It's absolutely gut feel, and it's actually worked out remarkably accurately. So we go through the stories one by one, then obviously reach a point where they say, really this is all we can do in this next 2 weeks, let's just stop. And there's nothing they can compare it to the work from the previous sprint, but they're not looking at the story points themselves, and it has worked out remarkably well. And I just feel like estimating in that 2-person team might have been an unnecessary overhead.
Yeah.
So perhaps estimating isn't always necessary in a Scrum team. But then again, I find in larger teams, it's a really valuable exercise.
Yeah, and I was just going to say so often as a Scrum Master, I might use the team's velocity just to help them out during sprint planning, especially with new teams where maybe I can sort of have a sense that it looks like they're overcommitting, or just to kind of coach them and say, well, how do you guys feel about this? And, do you realize last sprint, or your velocity has been 10 points and this sprint you're committing to 25? Is that, are you happy with that? Is that something you think you can achieve?
So that's using velocity really as a tool for sprint planning, basically, and just as a gauge, a guide for the team, really.
Yeah, and I think especially with new teams, it can be quite useful to talk to them and use their velocity to get an idea of sort of an average that the team seems to be quite happy with, and sometimes, coaching them and saying, well, do you think this was as difficult as the last sprint or not as challenging? And I mean, I wouldn't want the team to start committing purely based on their velocity.
Yes, yeah.
But I find it has been very useful for teams to use as a guide. Maybe if they've got a couple of complex stories, they might choose to estimate slightly below their velocity because they're unsure about those stories. If the backlog's full of really easy, small, well-defined stories, they might choose to go over.
Yep. So in that situation, it's really a fantastic team tool. Yeah. And we have an interesting question here from Nathan Donaldson. So how does a business owner know whether the team is working hard enough? And that's a good question. My first point is, does velocity help a business owner know if a team is working hard enough? Does that really have any bearing on how hard the team is working? Like we mentioned earlier, a team can easily game the system subconsciously or consciously to make it look like they're working harder. And I suppose based on that question, you get into the idea of what metrics do you actually use within Scrum and within Agile to look at how hard the team is working or how productive a team is, or whatever you want to actually call it. And there's lots of conversations about it. I won't go too deep into metrics because we've talked about it before, and it's just not fascinating to talk about for me, because people put too much weight on metrics, I feel at times, whether it's lines of code written. We've talked about that before. That's a ludicrous measure. For example, I saw a cartoon today, an Agile cartoon, and it was business owner goes over to a team member and says, how many lines of code did you write? And they said, I wrote 5 lines of code. And they said, that's not enough. And they said, well, it was a cure for cancer. And they said, still, it doesn't meet our metrics of lines of code written. So it's not really the output in terms of lines of code that you're looking for. It's the value that the team has actually created within the sprint.
Yeah, and I think, again, what we tend to see in Agile teams is if you empower the team to manage their work and estimate how much can be achieved and engage them, is you don't get into that situation where people doing a job, if they enjoy what they're doing and working in a team that they enjoy, they don't spend their time trying to slack off and do other things. They truly invested in the product and delivering value to a business owner. And so in teams that we've worked with that work with Agile, it's not been a problem that we've encountered.
No. And I think the more metrics you throw at an Agile team, the more you crush the soul of Agile in a way. And a lot of Agile has to do with trust in many ways, which is a difficult one to it makes it difficult to talk to, say, people who are new to Agile about it. But if you do work with the business owner daily, which you should be doing, then they will know that the team is actually working hard and the team is providing value, hopefully each and every day. And they'll also have an awareness from going to stand-ups and just talking to the team throughout the day of when things are going off track a little bit, or if they start to go off track, and hopefully they'll know straight away, so that can be put back on track really, really quickly.
And I think also in Agile teams, you find because a team has committed to delivering some work, if there is one member of a team that their team is underperforming or slacking off, often other team members will hold them to account rather than a business owner having to step in and, I suppose, crack the whip.
Yeah.
It does actually bring us that discussion around value and a business owner getting value does raise an interesting point that we've sort of been looking at recently with our teams around velocity and whether you include bug fixes in your velocity, or sort of maintenance type work that doesn't actually deliver new business value. And I think it's an interesting, again, a thing that a team can look at on a case-by-case basis. But so the premise of it is that Scrum is all about delivering value, and so your velocity should be a measure, or could be a measure of the new value that you deliver to a product every sprint. So, for example, if you had a sprint that had 10 points of work and 8 points of that was bug fixing, the total points would be 2 points that would contribute to your velocity.
At the moment, the teams that you're Scrum Master for, are they including their bug fixes in their velocity?
They are.
Yeah.
So I suppose what their velocity represents is the amount of work they get through in a sprint, not the amount of value that they deliver in a sprint.
Yeah.
And it's a team by team decision, but it's an interesting one to discuss with your teams and the product owner as well, because if you're a new product that you're developing and delivering value is the most important thing, maybe having that velocity that measures value would be more useful.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because obviously value, we're talking about measuring value and delivering value, and that's a bit of an airy-fairy term in lots of ways. How do you actually measure that? And that's possibly a good way to try to, at least, to get close to it.
And I think it would be something none of the teams that I'm working with have, I suppose, have wanted to use that way, and that's the product owners as well, because they didn't feel like that measure was useful to them. But it would be really interesting to try it with a team and see how that changes and changes the way that they work. But definitely something to try, I think.
And I've seen people, rather than count story points, they count the amount of stories that are actually being completed within the sprint, because each story itself, if written correctly and done correctly and meeting the invest model, is going to be creating a bit of value. So if you get through 10 stories in a sprint, that's a way to count it. And obviously stories are going to be of a wide variety of sizes, but over a period of time you'll get an average amount of stories that you might expect to get through in a sprint length.
Yeah. I suppose another thing contributing to velocity that teams often sort of talk to the Scrum Master about is when you have a story that's not completed at the end of the sprint, and maybe it's 8 points or something, and they've done 90% of the work. A lot of teams say, "Oh well, do we include that 8 points in that sprint to sort of maintain our velocity and bring a small 1 point story across, or how do we manage that?" I suppose from personally, again, we like, in the teams that I run, we like to just bring the whole story across, and so the 8 points carries to the next sprint.
Yes, yeah.
So one sprint has a very low points completed, but the next one will have lots.
Yes,
and your velocity, I mean, because it's an average, it balances out over time.
Yeah, I think that's, well, personally I feel that's a good way to do it, because if you shouldn't put any of those points towards the sprint if it's not completed, because then you haven't delivered any of that value there. We got another question here from Tony O'Halloran, but he said we already answered it, so just hey Tony. Yeah, no, I was in a sprint planning recently, yesterday, 2 days ago, where we reached a point where the team said that's all we can actually commit to this sprint. But the designer stepped in and said, well, actually, I think I haven't got that much work. And we talked to the product owner, would I be able to take some of the stories lower down the product backlog and bring those in, because they're smaller stories, and I feel I'll be able to complete these on my own in the sprint, even though they're of a lesser priority. And the product owner thought, yeah, okay, that's a good idea, even though they are lesser priority. We can't get any of the stories above it done in this sprint, so we'll take them in. And thought that was pretty interesting to watch happen. And that was also based just completely off gut feel and without using the actual points system at all.
Yeah, I think that's, I suppose, another good use of velocity is trying to see, well, you know, maybe we haven't got the capacity to take on this really big story, but we feel, you know, that there is space in the sprint for more work, and can we bring in something smaller? And again, having that discussion with the product owner about those sort of things is always really useful.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been reading obviously about velocity and this sort of stuff, and the more that I work with Scrum teams, the more I feel one of the best. It's sort of going back to that earlier question about the business owner or the team working hard enough. But measuring team happiness sounds like a very happy clappy sort of a thing to do, and in many ways it might be. But any time that a team isn't delivering what they feel they can deliver, if they're not delivering to the best of their abilities, they're just not happy. And you can sense it usually if you're fully involved with that team. You can usually get a feeling for if they're not happy, and if the product owner is not happy, and if they are producing at the best of their ability, if they're really self-organizing, high-performing team, everybody loves coming to work, and the mood is, you know, really fantastic all the time. So measuring team happiness, I think, might be the most valuable metric at all. I'd be willing to throw every other metric out the window and just have that one actually. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point. And you know, when you've got a happy team, and then generally the product owner is happy as well, and they do deliver consistently. And yeah, again, I think that metric is probably far more valuable than velocity or.
Yeah. I mean, what impact do you think it would have, for example, on your biggest Scrum team at the moment? Don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but what impact do you think it would have if you remove velocity from that team altogether?
I don't think it would be a huge issue. I think the product owner would have a problem with it.
Yes.
Because they do use velocity as a planning tool in the short term, to sort of gauge how much or where work fits and prioritize work. But for the team itself, I don't think that they would feel like they'd lost a lot. They've been going now as they've been an established team for months now. And I think they're quite happy with committing and don't really use velocity as a tool to sort of check their commitment. So I think they'd be quite happy to do away with it.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point that you brought up about the product owner would have an impact on the product owner because they use it for planning, and that's I think an excellent point because it is very useful for release planning.
Yeah.
So I mean that would have quite a detrimental effect to remove velocity in that situation. So I suppose you have to gauge things on a case by case basis. Just want to answer. We have another question here. So we have two questions. So we'll answer the first one. So how do you measure and reflect happiness?
Well, I suppose there are a number of ways you can do it, and you'd have to base that on your team. One thing that we've tried at Boost was when you come in the morning, just having 3 buckets and just dropping a ball. So there was, I can't remember the exact measures. There was a happy face, a kind of...
There's a meh face, a happy face, and a outright sad face.
Yeah. And you'd come in the morning and drop your ball in wherever you were feeling. So if you were stoked to come to work, you'd say, yep, I'm feeling happy. Someone would take a tally once everyone was in the office of how many happy, meh, and sad faces there were. And then leaving again, on your way out in the evening, you'd do the same thing. So if you'd had a really terrible day, maybe you'd drop one in the sad face, and we just kind of kept a running tally of those measures.
And I thought that was okay. I thought we made that a bit more complex than it needed to be. I think we just we base that sort of off the Nico chart. The Nico chart is a chart that you can use for measuring team happiness, and it's at the end of every day. You have this chart up on the wall, big visible chart, and people put either a sad face or a happy face by their name in that calendar date. And over a period of time, then you can see where the where the team has been feeling happy, where the team hasn't been feeling happy, and that can point to a lot of things. For example, if a team's really happy but not delivering, if you feel they're not delivering and they're really happy, there's obviously a problem there. Maybe people just don't care about what they're doing. And also if they're really sad but delivery seems to be high, there's something to investigate there. And I think it's a really good way of seeing the team happiness over a period of time. It's a very visual way, and usually there's going to be sad faces when there's big problems, and happy faces when everything's coasting along really, really nicely, but you never know, and you can get different information from that chart. And I thought the Nico chart was a simplified version of what you described, because it just asked people to do one thing per day, and it's not giving you 3 options, because that middle option, oh, do I just feel okay? I'm just melancholic. It just, you want to make it as easy as possible to actually measure their happiness. So if you have a look at the Nico chart, we'll put a link under the live stream video at the end as well. I think it's a really good way of measuring happiness. And Nathan also asked, did the balls and buckets stick? No, it didn't.
Nope.
It didn't. And I think that's because we made it too complicated, and that's something that we need to revisit. And I feel, who knows, we'll experiment. If we simplify it, it might be more successful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I suppose another...
And make it mandatory.
The other thing that you can do is, I suppose, as a Scrum Master, if you feel that happiness is a problem and you just want to explore that, is maybe run a few retrospectives consecutively, and activities within the retrospective that give you an idea of what the team is feeling. So mood lines is quite a good one for that. You can see how, I recently had a sprint where we had a deadline and things got a bit stressful, and we did mood lines in the retrospective, and you could see everyone was really happy. It's, as a project, the team is very happy, but as it went along, there's this massive dip around the release point, and then we came back up after the release. So if you can run a few, so mood lines is a great one.
Well, yeah, we ran that recently, you and I, for an external team, and it was the first time they'd ever done anything like that, and it was over the course of 6 months, so it was a massive mood line, took up the whole wall, and it was fantastic. The amount of honesty that came out of that was great, and people heard points and feelings from people that they never knew existed for the very first time, and it was quite amazing to watch. Yeah, mood lines is a good one. Yeah,
so I think if you ran that, I mean, you could even run that same exercise for 3 or 4 retrospectives.
So just a mood line, just to quickly describe, I suppose.
Yeah.
So you'd have, say you have a board here, and you'd have a horizontal axis, which would be the times. They might be your sprint. So you might have, week 1 and week 2, and then on your vertical here, you have a happy face up here and a sad face down here, and people will literally get a pen and talk about their sprint and draw a line along the timeline and go down if they were feeling pretty bad, and they'd go up here if they were feeling good. So you get sort of a graph of how they generally felt throughout the 2 weeks. We're getting close to the end of the show, and we do have one more question. from Tony. Let's see. And stop that measurement from becoming boring and ignored. So Nathan said, how do you measure and reflect happiness? And Tony said, and stop that measurement from becoming boring and ignored. Well, I think, yes, I suppose we already answered that, Tony, but that bucket system we had did become ignored, and it's something we want to revisit and look for a better way to do it, because obviously if people aren't using it, it's just not a useful thing to have around. And if I see, personally, I walk by that bucket of balls every morning and I saw that it wasn't being used, and I found it more actually slightly depressing to walk by it, so it was actually detrimental in a way, I felt.
I mean, I think, to touch on Tony's point, whatever metrics you're using, and Gavin's team where they sort of did away with sizing, whatever metrics and measurement you're using, if the team doesn't find it useful and it is boring and being ignored, it's time to change it up. If happiness works for you and your team find it useful and you're displaying it somewhere that's visible to the whole team and they take ownership of it, great. If happiness, obviously for us at Boost, the buckets and measuring happiness didn't resonate with the team, so stop doing it and move on to something else.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key elements of Agile, is not resting on your laurels and not just being content with things the way they are. It's always thinking of new ways to approach things and new ways to do things, and I think that's a challenge for a Scrum Master and the team, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we're just out of time now. So thank you very much. That was episode 41. We've been through quite a few episodes. And if anybody has any ideas or comments, please let us know. If you have something that you'd like us to discuss in the next episode of the board, please let us know as well. Thanks for watching today.
Cheers.